All right. Thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm Jacob Sills and the CEO of Uptrust. Before I hand it off to our awesome panelists, I want to take a minute to tell you a bit about our work here and why we're putting on this timely discussion, which is going to be the first in a series of conversations focused on driving practical criminal justice reform in a world with tightening budgets. Uptrust's mission is to keep people out of jail that shouldn't be there. We got our start with public defenders helping their clients attend court, and have recently expanded to community supervision to help staff build deeper relationships with their clients. We're building technology to support reform and humanize the complex journey for clients navigating the criminal justice system. We work with 500 counties across 28 states interested in helping their clients be more successful. We partner with jurisdictions big and small, urban and rural. Culture change and meaningful reform can be challenging, but to be honest, they're not revolutionary, which is why we're going back to the future today. So leading us on our journey is our very own Susan Rice. Susan?
Thank you, Jacob. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar, Back to the Future, hosted by Uptrust. We are so excited to have over 800 people from all over the country joining us today. I'm Susan Rice, and I will be serving as the moderator for today's discussion. I served as a chief probation officer in the state of Indiana for over 30 years and recently left that position to become the director of community supervision partnerships for Uptrust. The webinar today will not be about Uptrust or our products. However, please feel free to visit our website or shoot me a note afterward if you're interested in learning more about what we do. We're a technology company focused on promoting criminal justice reform and continuing education through candid conversations about ways to improve the system. Our format today is going to be pretty casual and hopefully interactive with all of you. We have 4 questions for our panelists, and then we'll jump into Q&A for the last few minutes. Please submit questions through the Q&A feature at the bottom menu bar. I would now like to give our speakers a minute to introduce themselves. Brian, would you mind kicking us off?
Brian, you're on mute.
Brian, I think you're muted.
Yeah, absolutely. So
there you go.
Welcome everyone. My name is Brian Lovins. I'm the principal for Justice System Partners, a small research agency looking to help build kind of the future for community corrections. I was formerly the assistant director in Harris County, so Harris County's adult probation system, and the incoming president for the American Probation and Parole Association.
Great, thanks, Brian. Ron, would you like to go next?
Sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Ron Corbett. I was with the Massachusetts Probation Service for almost 30 years, started as an officer, retired as the acting commissioner. I also spent 10 years as the executive director of the state Supreme Court in Massachusetts. Following retirement, I worked at the Robina Institute at the University of Minnesota Law School on a project on probation violations. And currently I teach at the University of Massachusetts Lowell.
Thanks, Ron. Scott?
Yes, that leaves me. Scott MadDonald. I'm a former probation officer of 30 years in Santa Cruz, California, and ended my career as chief there. And subsequent to that, I've been consulting in the area of juvenile and criminal justice, been working a lot with the NEKC reform, NEKC Foundation on juvenile justice reform, probation transformation, the deep end work there, and some work with California Forward, working in jails, conducting jail analyses. Happy to be here today.
Okay, thank you all. So everyone here has been both a practitioner and involved in system reform. The panel has a combined over 100 years of experience in probation. All that really means is that we are just old. Our theme today is Back to the Future. As many of you know, a man named John Augustus founded the field of probation in 1841. He felt that many people who were being driven to jail would instead be better served by kindness, support, and rehabilitation in the community. In the years since, we've seen probation practices change from simple rehabilitation to models promoting compliance and control. While that approach is at times needed with certain populations, it should not be the norm. Fortunately, it appears the pendulum has started to swing back toward the original vision of John Augustus, with probation officers serving as agents of change. Today, we'd like to discuss how those of us working in the field can return to our rehabilitative roots while embracing and utilizing research supporting evidence-based practices and the tools of the future. Now let's jump into our discussion with our wonderful panelists. So as I noted, probation has transformed quite a bit since its founding. Scott, would love to start with you. What is one key thing you think contributed to the shift toward command and control?
Okay, well, first off, I'm not as old as John Augustus, but I am old. And so I can't say just one thing. I'm going to say a few things. But so looking back over the last 4 decades, I'd say there were 3 sort of big influences that sort of led to our sort of orientation around command and control. First, a major influence was the now famous Martinson report in the 70s that claimed that nothing worked. And subsequent to that research, even Martinson himself refuted that. And in fact, a lot of the colleagues on the call with me today have worked quite a bit demonstrating that there are effective interventions. However, that really influenced the field and sort of moved us away from the more ambitious goals of rehabilitation to the less ambitious goal of punishment. Second, particularly in the 90s, in spite of dropping crime rates, there was a tough on crime stance that sort of took place politically. This was fueled by media reports of egregious but rare crimes that took the headlines. So in keeping with the motto, if it bleeds, it leads, that's what we saw. So that sort of environment, politicized environment, created a lot of harsh laws. That's where 3 strikes laws came up about throughout the country, harsh penalties even for nonviolent offenders, drug crimes in particular. And this, the implementation of these policies hit hardest on poor communities of color. Third, and I think this greatly changed probation practice, was the advent of technology that was almost purely focused on surveillance, detection, monitoring, and control. For example, drug testing and electronic monitoring. Those things greatly influence the field. So technology combined with a tough on crime mentality built upon a pessimistic notion of nothing works greatly influenced a system away from assistance and towards punishment and control. And that's not to say that we didn't have science moving practice in another direction, but these sort of ideas really kept a punitive model going and kept us from really transforming our culture back to sort of the John Augustus roots. So I'll turn to my colleagues to.
Yeah, no, I think, Scott, thanks. I appreciate the kind of the perspective. I think one place I would add is, you know, as we moved out of the 60s into the early 70s, there was a big distrust of systems and of government and of organizations as well. And right, and so trying to fix things was a bit scary, and people started to reject that along with the rehabilitation portions of our work. And so the piece I would add to is our focus, our unit of analysis, if you will, of probation and parole, our focus changed as well. So prior to the 70s, early 80s, and into the 90s, our focus was really at the person level. It was focused on the person on supervision and changing their behavior. And I think as we started to look at this spike in violence and this interest in kind of control, we started to look not at the person, but at the system. And we became focused on how can the system change people or at least protect the community. And our focus started to transition away from people to managing the system. And I think that had a big play in what came forward.
Susan, I think one thing I would add, just going back in history, because I started as an officer in the 70s, and Brian alluded to it, there was unmistakably a serious rise in violent crime during that period from what we had been used to in the 60s. And it got people's attention, for sure. You began to see public opinion polls, for example, in the 70s around election periods showing Americans' concern about rising crime. And there's no question that that got picked up by elected officials and everybody who was running for office. You know, if you were running for a local planning board, you had a tough on crime platform. So in the early going, in the 70s and into the 80s, when we were steadily seeing rising violent crime, I think the tough on crime period and the legislation that followed from it, like mandatory drug laws and the like, in the early going, was a reflection of a genuine concern about rising rates of violent crime. Scott's right to point out that that continued beyond the crime wave in the 90s. But I think it's fair to say that in the late 60s and then in the 70s and 80s, there was some concern about the violent crime rate, and no politician lost ground by running on a tough on crime platform. Fortunately, again, those numbers began to change later.
Right, and it is important to note that at the advent of all those three strikes laws in the 90s, crime was at a low point from the 20 years prior. So it just shows that sometimes practice is very slow. Practice changes very slow and doesn't really necessarily keep up with the realities of the times.
Just time-wise, it's interesting to note that the Martinson article that's been alluded to, my recollection was published in '74, and it came just at the time that earlier crime wave I'm referring to was occurring. So those two things occurring in time really gave lift to the tough on crime movement for a period of time,
Yep.
Well, I think the other thing that is clear is our system is steeped in deterrence, and that, right, we're based, especially on the legal side of the world, in this model of deterrence. And so it's not surprising that as we saw violence increase and crime spiking early and drugs, and right, our country's approach, or our legal system's approach, was deterrence, which means create tougher laws, create tougher penalties, and scare people into following the rules. And I think what's clear is that, you know, those kind of general deterrence models haven't panned out to really improve society. And in part, you know, we see this with voter registration laws and the like. A lot of times these deterrence rules actually block people from integrating back into the community and create some collateral consequences, right? So an attempt to keep people from not committing a felony by blocking them from allowed to vote at 19, right? As they try to transition back into the community at 27, when they're interested in voting, now there's no path back to them in many of the states. So, right, I think what we've seen, and we'll talk about in a minute, is this perspective of getting away from deterrence-based kind of approaches and really look at, you know, trying to change behavior through change-oriented approaches and rehabilitation, and versus trying to keep people from failing because of the consequences.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. I think that's a good segue into our next question. You know, we now have the benefit of decades of data on the impact of command and control tactics. And we know that for the vast majority of clients under supervision, simply catching failure does not really help to change their behavior. So looking forward, as probation evolves to realign with its founding principle of rehabilitation, what are 2 or 3 things that departments can do to help catalyze that shift? Brian, you want to start us out on this one?
Sure, I would love to. I'm excited actually for the future of corrections, and both on the community side and the prison side, incarceration. I think we have started to really understand a little bit better about the effects of corrections, and especially jail and pretrial kind of detention, as well as long-term effects of prison. We recognize that these types of interventions haven't had this impact on change in behavior. And so I think community corrections departments are really poised to start to look at stuff different. One, I think I alluded to earlier, is this idea of center of, or unit of analysis, or what our focus is on. I think it's clear that as we become more focused on behavioral change in the individual, we can see benefits to the community, right? And so in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, even early 2000s, we had this focus on protecting the community by surveilling people. And the truth is, surveillance products only, again, they're based on deterrence models. If I'm going to watch you closer, I'm going to catch you more often. And the truth is, those models, all they do is catch people quicker after they've committed the crime. And it doesn't stop people with serious drug problems staying sober. And it doesn't stop people with issues around violence and behavioral control issues becoming less violent, or folks with mental health issues becoming less, symptomatic with mental health issues. All it does is targets them to be caught quicker. And so I think a couple things that agencies are starting to adopt is really this understanding that the system has to be individualized, and going back to this concept that every person is unique and they bring a set of unique challenges to supervision or to corrections, and that we've got to really truly design models that help people change. And then the second area that I think is really, really important is this concept of moving, probation departments moving the discretion down, right? So in the 90s and 2000s, we had a bunch of departments who were writing policies at the highest level, at the administrative level, telling people how they're going to behave as an officer on the line with a person on supervision. And as an administrator, I can tell you right now, I couldn't write a policy that told people how to treat someone, face to face. We've got to write policies that allow for staff to do their best work. And to do that, we've got to give them discretion and the ability to manage and monitor and support behavioral change, and focus on not what people are failing about, right? But conceptually changing to look at the stuff that look at even inappropriate behavior from a progress. And so instead of looking at drug testing as 0-1, you failed or not, looking at are people improving their sobriety or their periods of sobriety over time. And so I think as agencies or as departments start to approach those concepts, then we start to shift our perspective to really being about how do we make the community safer through behavioral change, and not how do we make the community safer through detainment or containment models.
Susan, one shift, I think, or one lever that's available to us to facilitate that shift or reinforce it to rehab is something simple, and that is the hiring and promotional decisions we make. If we begin to hire for people with a set of skills that are really central to a rehab philosophy or a rehab priority, as opposed to skills that would be more appropriate for an emphasis on enforcement, that begins to have a big effect, I think. The word gets out, hey, if you want to work for this probation agency, develop your communication skills, develop your counseling skills, and so forth. The other powerful lever that's related is promotions. The kind of folks who rise up in organizations, if we really want to reinforce that philosophy, then the folks who are showing themselves to be real champions of this philosophy ought to be the folks who are picked out to move up in the organization. And that will have a very powerful effect, I think, on reinforcing a new culture, a new philosophy.
I have three things that I'd recommend that we focus on in probation, but I want to start by recognizing three realities that probation is challenged by. First, we have a huge volume of cases. People expect us to do a lot. Probation is the most widely used disposition in the criminal and juvenile justice system. Second, probation is asked to take on many functions. We are recommendation advisors to the court for dispositions and sentences. We supervise people on probation. We broker services. We sometimes get involved in direct services. We have more mobility and functions than just about any other justice system partner. And third, we have often suffered as an ill-defined, role-confused entity. Are we enforcers or are we helpers? Are we, to quote my colleague Brian, are we referees or are we coaches? Are we focused on control or assistance? So, understanding these big challenges, I have three recommendations. First is that probation jurisdictions should re-examine its purpose and ask itself, is it aligned with all that we know about behavior change? So really a conversation about purpose. Second, following from that conversation, an examination of practices. What are we doing in the day-to-day? Does it reflect that purpose or not? And third, I think we need to go beyond the tools. Evidence-based practices has done a lot for our field, but racial disparities persist. Inequities in our system persist. We have to establish frameworks that go sort of beyond the science, get back to the heart of the work, but also create space to become anti-racist organizations. Without doing that, without that statement, without that focus, we reinforce the status quo. You can't have it both ways. You're either an anti-racist organization or you're a part of a system that has, promoted bias systemically and institutionally. So those are three things that I think we should focus on.
Thank you, Scott.
I really appreciate your point around race, gender equity, ethnicity equity, right? Like, I think we can't talk about the future of community corrections without a lens of equity. And I don't know how many people in our audience have had an opportunity to look at or read Kennedy's book around how to be an anti-racist. But I think super powerful when we think about like the justice system can be an opportunity to really rid the system from policies and practices that lead to disparities in outcomes. And to be able to do that, we've got to look at our work in a lens of like, what is anti-racist? So, right, writing policies and practices that improve the ability of our system to have an equitable outcome. And I'll give you one example so to kind of put this in perspective for people is the entry point into specialty courts, right? And so specialty courts historically, now this is changing as we start to view this through a different lens, but historically, access to specialty courts was blocked by a history of violence. And many specialty courts, the history of violence didn't have to be a conviction. It could be a charge. It could be a written statement in a charge that never even got to the level of a charge. It can be any history of violence, both at the juvenile and the adult level, that would block your entrance into a specialty court. So if you had a serious substance abuse problem, and let's say at 19 years old, you got pulled over by the police, you got in an argument with the police while you were high, and a police officer wrote in their statement that you were resisting arrest and were aggressive. This could block your entrance into a specialty court at age 41. And so blocking, right? And so then you see, right, historically, this differential entrance to specialty courts by race and by ethnicity, and this overcharging or overrepresentation of historical violence. And so that's an area where I think as probation parole, we could dig into and flag and say, let's take violence off the list. Let's allow people with a history of violence to be part of a drug court. Why not? What does violence stop people from getting sober? Don't we want sober people regardless of whether they have a violent past or not? So that's one example, I think, of many that we could talk about that would lead to an anti-racist perspective or lens on community corrections.
And two things real quick. You need data, and you need to get comfortable with uncomfortable conversations. There needs to be a space to talk about it and to look at it.
Yeah, I love that, Scott. One of the things we talk about is that, change is easy to talk about, but it's really difficult to implement, and that includes those uncomfortable conversations. So for our next question, what's something inexpensive and easy that you would recommend that all departments do? And then on the flip side of that, what about something that's a little more complicated but equally important? Ron, do you want to start us on this one?
Sure. Two things that come to mind that I think are important building blocks of this new return to our old way of doing business. One is to switch our emphasis in supervision from detecting failure to recognizing success, to acknowledging success. I mean, we learned a long time ago, right, in behavior modification theory, that the power of positive reinforcement is really a multiple of a more negative approach. But I think it's fair to say that throughout our history, and I think this has changed along with many other things recently, we saw our first priority as, catching people screwing up instead of catching them doing something right. So the first thing I would say is to really focus like a laser on incremental progress. Things like a couple of negative drug tests in a row, or 3 or 4 appointments kept, or AA meetings gone to. In other words, really search out things that folks we supervise are doing that deserve reinforcement, and being as consistent about that as we can be. I think we have every reason to believe that not only will reinforce our philosophy, but be more successful in changing behavior. The second, and that doesn't cost anything. The second thing I would say is I hope we radically rethink the conditions of probation, the standard conditions of probation. In my own view, the load in most cases we put on probationers is just completely unreasonable and mission impossible. When you talk to people under supervision, this comes up all the time. I can't do 10 or 15 things. I don't have the means for that. I'm preoccupied with just getting through the day, and there are things, I recognize I'm on probation, there are things I have to do, but if it's a piling on of requirements, I'm bound to fail. Too many tripwires, too many ways for me to get in trouble, and my life is too complicated to avoid all those. So I would call for a radical rethinking of what we require people to do when they're placed on probation. I would take the standard forms and just throw them away and start from scratch and say, okay, what if, and I'll just end with this would, thought experiment, right? what if every time we placed somebody on probation, we didn't have the forms to rely on, but we had a blank sheet of paper? And we had to be purposeful and intentional about what we were asking people, how we were going to fill that sheet and what we're going to ask people to do. And, you know, I'd like to see conditions get down, and I think it's possible. It would require some statutory change. I recognize that, but statutes can be changed. I would like to see the requirements get down in the area of a handful so that it's feasible, so that there are opportunities to succeed and not just exposure to failure everywhere you turn. So those two things, emphasizing positive recognition as much as we can, and right-sizing the conditions of probation so they're feasible.
Brian, I just want to say here. I mean, I think Ron, you nailed it. There's, you know, we know from the behavioral science how reinforcing rewards incentives are. And I read a piece last week about just in it's something even in adult systems not used rarely in drug treatment, but it's very, very powerful, much more powerful than punishers. And yet our system still relies on the punishers, not the rewards. Little incentives like shorter terms on probation. And so when I started about, you know, thinking about, we think of our systems as beleaguered and under budgetary strain. And I used to say there's two kinds of budgets that I knew of: bad budgets and then really, really bad budgets. But, you know, there's never enough money. But one thing we should recognize is that the status quo is not necessarily cheap and easy. Systems focused on compliance and control generate great expense in identifying, jailing, and litigating probation failure. And the behavioral sciences say there's a better way to do that. So I think as a starting point, like I totally agree, you know, shorter probation terms, less conditions, particularly conditions that have nothing to do with criminogenic factors, it would be a good start. Also, simple metrics in an agency around success. We count a lot of failure, capture a lot of failure, but how many people successfully get through probation? How many people, you know, and the more, you know, that old saying, what gets measured, what gets done. I believe the saying, every system is perfectly designed to get the results that it's getting. Probation is now getting a lot of flack for being a system that's generated a lot of failure and created pathways to jail, not necessarily away from jail. And we got to get better at what should be our number one identity in the system is the agent of change. We work with people, not just a point in time, but over a period of time, and are in the best position to do that. So Brian, can you?
Yeah, no, I think that's right on. So Susan, to your question, again, cheap and expensive and easy and hard. To be honest, usually the least expensive stuff are the hardest things. And the most expensive things are the easiest, right? We can go out and buy a curriculum. Like we can get trained in a curriculum. We can drop an evidence-based practice in the middle of our agency and expect some X number or proportion of people to do better. And we're going to get some effect. But the reality is we're dropping behavioral change model or behavioral change intervention in the middle of a system that isn't necessarily designed for behavioral change. Our system is designed to monitor, blow the whistle, and catch people failing, right? Think of the conditions, as Ron said, right? The conditions are written so that probation officers and parole officers are actually watching for failure. They're not watching for success, right? They're not watching for improvement in the moment. They're bearing it against, okay, I'm going to watch you. And my condition says, you know, do not use drugs. And so anytime you use drugs, you're failing that condition, which then puts everyone in this place of discretion. Have you failed enough? Did you use enough? Did you go to treatment enough? And the person who's on supervision is like, oh my God, do I come back? Am I going to get revoked right now? Right? So it creates this whole space of uncertainty. And in today's world, we understand that certainty allows for people to behave in ways or change their behavior. Uncertainty creates these problems and this uncomfortableness. And so my easy strokes that are really hard is twofold. One, we have to get to a system that, as Scott eloquently said, and better than I ever could, is we have to get to a system where our purpose is, really clear, crystal clear, and that our work is actually tied around purpose, which is to change people's lives, to make people in a better space or help them get to a better space. Right. So that's the first one. The second one is, as administrators, and I had to learn this lesson as a assistant director in Harris County. As administrators, our jobs are not to be super probation and super parole officers. And that's tough, right? Like, we have to think of ourselves as running a business attempting to better people's lives, not as a fourth layer away probation officer on how to do probation or parole. What that means is, as leaders, we've got to rethink, right? Our purpose within community corrections should be to develop an environment where our staff can do their best work. And I have to say that as an administrator, I talk to lots of administrators across the country. That's not their purpose. Like, we haven't really done a great job of helping people see, as they move up in corrections, that their role and their purpose changes, and that their purpose is to create an environment where people can do their best work. And their best work is helping people get better. And if we start to think of that, those are two free elements that cost no money but are super hard. Some of the more expensive stuff that you can do is, obviously, we know that even in the light of challenges around disparity, that risk assessment and adoption of risk assessment and understanding it and really digging into what this means for us, we do better. One, because we avoid messing with folks that are low risk and that are going to kind of reestablish themselves or kind of readjust, if you will, without messing them up, but also where our efforts are on high risk folks and that are struggling. Now, the problem is our system is designed to take those high risk people and surveil them tighter and broker them tighter. And right, we've got to think of what are the strategies around behavioral change. And so we've got to adopt models that are designed to help people with serious problems get better. And to Ron's point, we build those systems from a perspective of where you stand today and work towards measuring progress for the future, not making you expect to be perfect today and create hopelessness where we're setting you up against a standard that you can't take. And one of the things that I would envision as a bellwether mark or benchmark for probation departments and parole departments moving forward would be what proportion of people take their time over supervision. Mm-hmm. And right, that tells me if more people are taking their jail and prison time over a year or 2 or 3 in the community, it tells me the word out there is that supervision is too tough. And if supervision's too tough and we're not supportive and it's only going to end up in failure anyway, then we've got to change that mantra, and we got to change our perspective to say, look, if you take supervision, we're here to help and not here to just catch you down the road.
Okay. Thank you, Brian. I want to keep us moving because I know we have a lot of questions. So our final question for the panelists. We wouldn't be here today if we didn't think that probation had the ability to have a profound positive impact on people's lives. So Scott, if you want to start us off, what is your vision of what probation should be in the future?
Okay, I'm going to put it in 3 C's, okay? First, change. We have to, and by change, I mean, recognizing and fully believing and being rooted in the fact that we believe people are changeable, positive change can happen. We need to be reestablish our identity as a profession that promotes rehabilitation and safety through long-term positive change. 2, we need to community. We need to, JQ public doesn't necessarily understand what probation does or who we are. And yet we should really be working, our services should be centered in the community and working with the community as partners to create paths of desistance for adults and juveniles. So I think, and 3, the third C would be courage. You know, we talked on this call already about really taking on some of the systemic and institutional problems that have been perpetuated for years in our systems. And I think probation could really take a leadership role in that. So essentially, we got to get back to the future. We got to get back to John Augustus. John Augustus successfully demonstrated that change was possible. He rarely, I mean, probation was organized around the idea as an alternative to jail. And he was very successful at creating pathways away from jail and rarely pathways that return to jail. That's not the probation that we have today. He also understood that, well, first off, John Augustus was a community volunteer. And he tapped into a lot of the philanthropy and angels, the goodwill that exists in community to get the job done. He didn't do it alone. And third, he understood that justice systems were not necessarily fair and equitable. He understood some of the root causes that brought people to the system. And in fact, he said, quote, "Temples of justice should be watched." And as his role was to try to infuse into the system sort of a more positive notion that change could happen and that some people needed a little more support and help to get rid of the barriers that brought them to the system or the challenges. So I'll just say Back to the Future is what we need to do. Ron or
Ron?
Sure. I envision a system where when we conduct exit interviews, which we should as people leave probation, in great numbers they say, "I felt I was treated fairly. I felt my probation officer really wanted to help me to succeed. I felt I was treated with respect and dignity." You know, I think of Jennifer Skeem's fabulous article about what are the characteristics of effective probation officers, those who help keep their folks out of trouble and moving on in a positive way. And the 3 words she came up with are firm, fair, and caring. So I would love to think that when we do exit interviews, which we should do routinely, instead of only here and there, that we would hear the equivalent of that from people as, you know, I got a fair shake. What they asked me to do was, you know, it was a stretch for me, it was feasible. And when I made a good move, they recognized it. And I got a reward. You know, I got 2 years probation at first, but, you know, because of my efforts, it was reduced by at least 6 months. And I appreciate that. That's what I'd hope to hear in exit interviews. And let me just say in the exit interview, last point, I think it would go a long way in advancing the kinds of values we're talking about if we open up a new kind of dialogue with the folks under supervision. And by that, I mean, bring them into the discussion in a serious way. Ask them what's working. Ask them what improvements we can make. Ask them what sets them back in the course of supervision. We get a twofer from that. One is we get really good intelligence about how we can do better. But the second and last thing I would say is we bestow a tremendous amount of respect on folks we supervise when we ask their opinion and genuinely listen to it. So I think that would be exit interviews and focus groups, if you like, I think would give us great dividends.
Yeah, I agree, Ron. I think I think we're at a really interesting point in the correction system. The pendulum swings often, right? Every 20 years, we swing back and forth. And I think we're all getting tired of the pendulum swing, right? We're getting tired of being a social worker and then law enforcement officer, then social worker and back and forth. And I think it's time to really put everything together. I'm actually super excited about the future of corrections for a couple of reasons. One, I think we're starting to recognize the need to celebrate success. The people that work in our field are incredible people that work really, really hard to do their jobs, right? They try hard. They're in a system that may be forcing them to do certain things or respond to certain stuff, but they really try hard to make the best out of folks' situations. And so I think we've got to start defining who we are better. As a field, we have been defined by, and I see in the chat questions, many questions about, well, this is all great, but there's a context to all of this, which is the larger criminal justice system. And we've been often defined by judges, prosecutors, defense attorneys, corrections staff, legislators on what probation should be. And we have to take ownership of what we can do and what our capacity to do is. And we've got to start recognizing and being really clear that we make differences in people's lives. And that if we focus on that and become laser focused on actually being the group of people who help people who are on supervision, who without us would end up in prison and their lives would be even worse, that we have the capacity to change their lives and demonstrate that through data, through stories, through experiences, and through sharing information. I think we've got to join together with the system and with the people, as Ron said. We've got to start to recognize that the people that are on supervision actually want to change. We've got to change. We got to come from that perspective, because I think in our past, we have lost that perspective and think that we are fighting the people that are on supervision and trying to force them to change. The reality is no one wants to go to prison. Well, very few. Of course, someone's going to find the rare event, or the rare person. But the truth is no one wants to go to prison. That's why they show up to probation. If they didn't want to come to, if they were okay with the punishment, they just would stop coming or never show. And so people do come. We've got to do better at measuring progress, right? Think of the proportion of conversations that each of you have had with your boss. I guarantee 80-85% of the conversations you have on a daily basis are about people failing, although your success rates in your departments are 65, 70, 75%. We focus our conversations on failing and then wonder why we feel like we fail. We need to shift our conversations to be about who we're helping and under what circumstances, and then understand the circumstances we're not helping people under, and then improve those and get better at those. And we've got to then apply the tools. And what we've done in the last 20 years is take evidence-based practices and give the tools and then try to figure out how to do the rest. And tools don't fix anything without content, without context. And so without the previous set of things around joining and pride and measuring success, tools are useless. And so I think there's a couple of things that I envision in the future. One is technology, right? We've used technology as a surveillance tool and as a way to monitor and measure people's failure in the last 20 years. And I think we need to change that. Technology is here to help support. Technology and technological advances, right? I use Noom to lose weight, right? That's all positive psychology. It's all cognitive behavioral models that are actually helping people change their behavior through learning about themselves and growing. And the same thing can be true in corrections. We need to shift our tools and to our technology tools to be positive supported. We need to build success plans for people. So one easy change that we could adopt moving forward is change the language. We should get rid of every supervision plan and every case plan out there. We don't have case plans and supervision plans in our field. We should have success plans. Our plan should be built to help people be successful. And just that language change would change the perspective. And so I'm excited. I think it's a great opportunity. I think there are organizations, obviously like Uptrust, but APPA, ACA, right? Organizations that are geared towards helping improve this and building it. And so I think grabbing this momentum change and tagging along to it and moving us forward, I think is an incredible, important piece.
Susan, I'm noticing there's a lot of great questions here, and at the risk of sounding like we're talking in platitudes, and there's really good questions, I'm just wondering if we might want to think about copying this chat. I don't know how much time we have left, probably not. And I'm thinking, with Brian's role in APPA, that these are great discussions to maybe introduce into other venues so that we can honor the thought that I'm seeing in this chat, because there's no way we can answer all of them, right? So
right.
Just
yeah. So we have about 3 minutes left. And I think what we'll do, we'll go ahead and start with one of the questions. We may talk a little bit longer and go over. We know people may have to hop off, but we won't go too long. And then we're going to download this presentation or upload it, I guess, to our website, make everything available. So we'll work at getting all the questions answered. But let me start with one, because I think this is pretty important. So how do we involve more system partners in our solutions? So even with culture change, a significant roadblock is that our field is responsive to the local legal culture. What can we do as a field to help local communities, judges, district attorneys, et cetera, to engage in the reform along with probation? And jump in as you feel.
That's for 3 minutes. That's a big question to answer. So I'm going to try to do the shortest version. There's a word called collaboration, and in the middle of that word is embedded the word labor. But what we need to do is we need to change. We need to have more partnership, more discussions, and think of not just our usual suspects as stakeholders. So this question, there's a lot really important in that, like changing court conditions. You got to have the judiciary on board. That means a conversation. That means a discussion about purpose, maybe with them as well, right? Ron talked about exit interviews. Do we get feedback from the community? Do we know our community? Do we know all the assets in the community? Can technology be used for asset mapping? Because, Pastor Joe, who's playing basketball every night and given out free food, maybe isn't even known to the probation department. So there's a lot in that question, and there's a lot in the answer, but I think we just need to put one foot in front of the other and think of our role as a little more expansive.
Yeah,
I love that, Scott. I think, yeah, I love that. I think the point I would say is that we have to elevate our profession. I think not in every light with judges and prosecutors and folks that work in the system is probation and parole understood, what we do. And I think we are often a subset, especially at the probation side, a subset of the judiciary, and that we fall under there. In some states, that's not true. We're in the executive branch side, but I think we have to elevate our professional standing, which includes, to be honest, creating a set of professional standards. We don't own a set of professional standards in this field. So there's nothing out there that says this is what probation and parole officers do. And so it can be shaped and shifted by local government control, and a judge or a prosecutor or a legislator somewhere says this is what I think they should do. We should really set out a real clear set of standards of what our work is.
Okay, great. I'm going to go ahead and do one more question. So how do you establish a baseline to determine how well your organization is doing at being anti-racist and at being a coach versus a referee?
Well, let me take a shot at that. I want to go back to the idea of engaging the people we supervise in a conversation. And part of that conversation on the question of discriminatory practices or perceptions of discrimination is opening up an honest dialogue with the folks we supervise. How's it going? What's positive about what's going on? What troubles you about what's going on? And then, and the last question concerned our partners. We have to be able to step outside ourselves and ask others that we work with how we are perceived, get their feedback. So I think there's ways to look internally for what the experience is like and create authentic, honest dialogue with people so that they can share a sense that they're, if they feel they're being treated inequitably. And if we develop those good partnerships, Susan, that you raised in the last question, we can go to them and say, hey, tell me how you perceive our agency. What's our reputation in the community? Give us some honest feedback on how we're doing. So those are a couple of quick thoughts.
I'll add a couple things to that. In terms of baselines, I mean, one question I would ask is, do you know what's your rate of probation violations for every person who gets on probation? Do you know what that rate looks like for African American, Latinx, white folks? So there's a lot of data that could be disaggregated with regard to the race issue that could help sort of illuminate areas on where disadvantage occurs or where overrepresentation occurs. Second, one of the things that I've done in some jurisdictions is developed a tool that just looks at practices, 128 different practices, and what are you doing on a daily basis? And including practices like, is there space in your organization? Is there an equity team? Is there space to talk about race? And I think that kind of survey, if you will, of practice could lead to discussions around purpose and then what you could do differently. So those are just a couple things that I think systems could do as starting points. Brian, I don't know if you have anything to add. Or did we lose him?
Well, it looks like we may have lost Brian. So I think we will go ahead and wrap up with that. I know people, I'm sure, have other things to do and your time is valuable. But thank you all so much for coming today. It's conversations like this that move our field forward. A huge thank you to our panelists, Brian, Ron, and Scott. We really appreciate all the time and the thought that you all put into this. We had hundreds of people join us today, so it's clearly a topic that many people are interested in. We know some people had some difficulty logging in, so like I said, we will upload this presentation to our website, send a link out to everyone who registered so people who missed it can go back in and see it. And we will work on getting answers to the questions. Thank you all so much for posing those. I wish we had more time. We will be hosting more discussions like these in the future, and we always welcome ideas. So if there's a topic that you're particularly interested in, please shoot us a note and we'd be happy to put something together. And then finally, if you would like to receive a training certificate for continuing education hours, we will include a template in a follow-up email later this week. So thank you all again for coming and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you all.